Young people seem to be less and less interested in motorcycling. We've talked about this on this channel before, and while much of this is to do with changes in culture, such as the way in which today's young people are more risk-averse and more financially disadvantaged, much of the blame falls on manufacturers for failing to adapt their strategy to fit the next generation of prospective riders. With an increase in urbanization and greater access to more cost-effective forms of transports like e-bikes or ride-sharing apps, there's really not a demand for fast, expensive, powerful motorcycles. Motorcycles have long been tailored to enthusiasts that want big, loud, performance-oriented bikes. Whereas today, younger generations are way more concerned about practicality, sustainability, and affordability. A new study showed that in 2024, new motorcycle registrations grew on average 10% in a single year across Europe, with countries like Germany and Spain growing closer to 15%. And it wasn't just a bunch of middle-aged Euro dudes buying BMW GSs. The data showed that much of the growth was related to an increasing interest in urban mobility. Motorcycling has always been about leisure in America compared to dense areas in Europe, Asia, or India, where small bikes are just seen as a convenient form of transportation. I think OEMs need to recognize this mentality to encourage the growth of new riders in the US and see the way the tides are going. More and more people are living in cities, more and more people are going to want the ease of getting around on two wheels and the ease of parking a two-wheeled vehicle. Maybe expend less resources putting adaptive cruise control on big sport touring bikes or squeezing out another 4 horsepower on their flagship leader bikes, and instead market motorcycles as a fun, practical form of transportation and less like a super expensive, powerful toy for gearheads. Manufacturers are not only failing to capture the interest of new riders, they're also losing loyalty of their devout customer base by discontinuing established models for the sake of cost-effective, cross-platformed, emission-compliant machines that are laden with superfluous tech. It's like as motorcycles keep getting more expensive, they're not only becoming less attractive to prospective riders, they're also becoming less attractive to existing riders. If you've been riding for a decade or two and you see your favorite OEM discontinue a flagship model and replace it with the bike that is more expensive and bloated with features, you're probably not going to go out of your way to run out and purchase one. If you've been riding a motorcycle without blind spot monitoring for 10 years, you're not going to be like, wow, I always needed blind spot monitoring, better go trade up my bike for a newer one that costs 40% more and has the latest tech package. Inline 4 sport bikes seem to be going the way of two strokes. Instead of investing and adapting these models to be emissions compliance, they're just being axed entirely. And while there are certainly merits to these new sport bikes that use parallel twins and 3-cylinder engines, there has been without a doubt a ton of outcry from diehard enthusiasts. Displacement creep is definitely breaking the motorcycle industry too. Beginner bikes are inching closer and closer to middleweight bikes, and middleweight bikes are practically leader bikes now. And sport bikes and hyper-naked bikes can be punching well above 1000 cc's now. This continual growth in size is just like feigned advancement. If you make your most powerful engine even bigger and even more powerful, you can then subsequently make your middleweight bike bigger and more powerful, and then make your beginner bike bigger and more powerful as well. As an example, everyone's up in arms about the new Panigale V2 because it makes 120 horsepower out of an 890cc engine, but if you look back at the Ducati 916, those are basically the same power specs, and that was the flagship bike back then. For the most part, these different tiers in the power progression have always existed, but now they're being assigned to different bikes in a manufacturer's lineup. Much of the displacement creep has to do with satisfying increasingly strict emissions regulations as well. In layman's terms, if you have two engines that make relatively the same power, but one is slightly larger, it will produce fewer hydrocarbons and allow it to remain within acceptable range for emission standards. But with bigger engines, manufacturers can market them as being more desirable and charge higher prices. The Ninja 400 to 500 is a perfect example. The Ninja 400 is a perfectly acceptable functional beginner sport bike, and the bump to 451cc for a little bit more torque doesn't really add a lot to the whole experience. These little displacement increases contribute to the illusion that the new bike is better, it's bigger, it's more advanced, and more desirable, when in reality it's fundamentally the same motorcycle. It's just kind of this absurd cycle that isn't really doing the industry any favors as a whole. When it comes to really powerful machines, riders don't need any more power. A motorcyclist will be far more limited in their own skill than by the performance of their bike. And we need electronics to manage all that power anyways now because they're basically unrideable. This constant displacement creep is just another strange element of the modern motorcycle industry that's a little out of whack when you think about it. A lot of young men are riding motorcycles for the wrong reasons. There seems to be a whole subsection of riders who are insistent on owning the most expensive bikes, riding as recklessly as possible, and broadcasting it to the entire world on social media. Look, Street squids have always existed, but with the rise of online content, the average motorcycle squid has evolved into some sort of super squid. Reckless and unsafe riding behavior has been hybridized with online flex culture to make the most distasteful version of motorcycling known to man. While I recognize people can live their own lives and make their own choices, I can't help but think that the proliferation of brain-rotted 24-year-olds wheeling S1000RRs down the freeway in 4K resolution is a net negative for the motorcycle industry as a whole. If young people are provoked to explore motorcycling due to the exposure of this type of squid flex culture, their motivations and attitudes towards the sport are going to be very flawed. They'll be encouraged to buy a bike that is not only far more powerful than they can handle based on their skill level, but also too expensive. The risk they'll take while riding will lead to serious injury, financial hardship, or worse. And then ultimately, if this type of rider lives long enough for their prefrontal cortex to fully develop, they'll hopefully outgrow these immature motivations for clout and likely move on from riding in general due to the cost or the risk involved. My point being, young guys who start riding for the wrong reasons are not setting themselves up for a sustainable and holistic career in riding. Riding a motorcycle for clout or to flex online doesn't have a ton of longevity, and it doesn't even make a lot of money, to be honest. A lot of this content can't even be monetized, and this is such a small niche. Unless you're lucky enough to be able to monetize such content, you're going to end up with a ton of wasted money and time chasing phantom benchmarks when billionaires are just getting rich on the platforms anyways. When instead, people should pursue riding for personal fulfillment. Bikes are fun, exciting, and confidence-inspiring. If you pursue riding for intrinsic reasons, you're gonna have a much longer riding career than if you wanna get a bike for outside validation. The fact that this mentality isn't readily available to young people whose curiosity in motorcycling is piqued by trendy, flashy, surface-level, short squid content is just one of the reasons why motorcycling is broken a little bit. Very much related to the proliferation of flex offender street squids is the fact that motorcycling is just too expensive now. It's become a hobby tailored to rich dentists or lawyers, childless two-income households, or working class dudes who make really bad financial decisions. To pursue motorcycling in a financially savvy way, you need a lot of patience and diligence. If you're to go about riding in the easiest way possible, you'd come out spending close to like $10,000 on a new beginner bike with loan and interest, gear, and insurance cost. And for a lot of people, especially younger folks, they just can't justify spending $10,000 on what'll essentially be just a weekend hobby. So to start motorcycling on a budget, you'll have to exercise a lot of patience, searching out a good deal on a reliable used bike, shopping closeout sales for your helmet and gear, and cross-shopping multiple insurance quotes. Motorcycle manufacturers seem to care very little about making motorcycles financially accessible and instead are content on squeezing as much revenue as possible out of their more quote-unquote qualified customer base. We see this across the board, but premium OEMs are the biggest culprit for investing heavily in their big expensive flagship machines and completely rejecting the entry-level segment. Even though there's been an uptake in more beginner offerings that are still pushing those $6,000 marks, unfortunately, which isn't an inconsequential amount of money for a lot of younger folks. And that's just to get started riding. Most American riders aren't going to want to stick with the 400 or 500cc bike for more than a few years, so buying into the sport can feel like an uphill battle for the duration of your time as a rider. Relative to inflation, motorcycles aren't necessarily more expensive than they used to be, but compared to the average person's purchasing power in 2025, they're still very unattainable for many. The modern dealership experience isn't really doing any favors for the motorcycle industry either. The amount of inflated fees and price markups you see on some new bikes is totally crazy. When you buy a bike from the dealership, on top of the MSRP, they make you want to pay freight and destination charges, setup fees, and dock fees. These are all bundled up in the out-the-door price for the bike, meaning it's going to cost $7,000 or more for a brand new beginner bike. This will then be buttoned up with a nice loan and an outrageous APR where the dealer makes a percentage of the additional interest paid. And they'll say, hey, if you finance this bike over 60 months, you're only paying $150 a month. And if you're not thinking critically about it and thinking about only your monthly payment, you're gonna end up paying significantly more in the long run. That's not to mention any extended warranties they try to push on you. Warranties that can be voided if you install aftermarket parts or ride your bike on track or off-road. You always gotta read the fine print. There's evidence to suggest that if manufacturers could figure out a direct-to-consumer sales system, riders would have even more purchasing power and be less susceptible to dealer exploitation. And don't even get me started on the cost of servicing your bike at a dealer. They're out here trying to charge $200 for an oil change when materials cost $50 and it's like a 30-minute job that almost anyone can do with one socket. There are good dealerships out there, don't get me wrong, but there are plenty of greasy dealerships that exploit the outdated dealer system and make purchasing a motorcycle way more costly and unattractive to new riders. And lastly, the middleweight category needs to be realigned. There used to be way too many bikes all being lumped into the middleweight category, but now it seems to be be the segment that's getting the least amount of attention. Manufacturers are, of course, always interested in maximizing their top-of-the-line bikes. The customers who are looking to spend $20,000, $30,000 or more on a motorcycle are probably less discerning when it comes to value proposition. So they squeeze another 3 horsepower out of the S1000RR, call it brand new for the upcoming model year, and some guy who doesn't have a wife or family goes out and takes a loan for it. Manufacturers are also investing more into affordable beginner bikes in an attempt to bring more riders into the fold and perhaps grow them into these highly valuable riders in the future. But once riders have grown past their beginner bikes, there's less and less viable and affordable options to progress to, and the bikes within this middleweight category seem to be the slowest to update. For instance, Honda sells a ton of mini bikes, 300s and 500s. Then they have the Goldwing, Africa Twin, the CBR 600, and the 1000RR on the top end. When it comes to just normal, practical middleweight bikes, they're kind of limited to the CBR and the CB650R, which are fine bikes, but a little out of touch in today's market. They have the Transalp 750 in the States now, which is cool, but they still don't sell the Hornet 750 in America for some reason. Kawasaki will sell the ZX4RR, a pretty niche offering, but hasn't brought their Ninja Z650 platform into the modern era. Suzuki thankfully has their new parallel twin platform because otherwise the SV650 was kind of looking like a dinosaur. There are of course some gems like the MT-07, but otherwise the real sort of 75 to 85 horsepower sub $10,000 middleweight segment is kind of hollowed out. Manufacturers either want to sell sub 50 horsepower beginner bikes or 100 plus horsepower bikes because they're still considered to be middleweight offerings, which is painfully ironic because the segment that sees the least amount of investment right now would be the most attractive to a lot of riders who want a fun, usable bike at an attractive price point. Which you could make the case that the middleweight adventure category has pretty much taken that over, so something to think about there. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one. I hope it didn't come across as some dude ranting into his phone camera in the cab of his pickup truck, but I want to see more riders here in the States, and I fear the manufacturers might not have the right priorities in place to make it happen. But what do you think? Is it too cynical of a take? Should we all just happily ride $20,000 motorcycles and not think too hard about it? Thanks again for watching. I'll see you later. Fact: knocker-uppers were people who woke up workers in the early Industrial Revolution by tapping on their windows or shooting peas at them. The practice was common in Britain, Ireland, and the Netherlands. Goodbye.
You've made it to the end of another Yammy Noob video. Aren't you just a special little cookie? Aren't you just something so great? Aren't you just, look at you, you're just so freaking cute. Why don't you go ahead and click on the next video? Why don't you go ahead, listen, hey, I'm just kidding around. Hey, listen to me. Click on the video.